Good Saturday evening to you. I'm 10 Tampa Bay meteorologist Natalie Ferrari. The time is now 8:30 and we are joining you live on this broadcast to bring you the very latest on the tropics, one of which, yes, is Tropical Depression 10 that formed earlier this afternoon just off the Yucatan Peninsula. Now I'm going to go ahead and just get you an overview, walking through what we are dealing with in the Atlantic. There are two disturbances out there. These actually 8 o'clock updates just came in on these two disturbances, and their chances for development continue to remain on the lower end. So we are not worried at all about all that activity. We do have a hurricane, Hurricane Franklin, still churning in the western portions of the Atlantic, heading gradually to the north towards Bermuda, and it is forecast to not only continue to strengthen by early next week, but likely to become our first major hurricane of the season at a Category 3. Early next week. That will be no concern for us here in the United States. So there's some good news, thankfully, but let's talk about what will be bringing some impacts as we go through the next several days. It's actually some activity that just got its act together today. This is Tropical Depression 10. So you see all this convection continuing to churn just to the right of it. We've seen that really pick up within the last 24 to 36 hours, continuing to see a lot of that thunderstorm activity just develop. And now we officially have a closed low right here, just positioned over the Yucatan Channel. So right, just kind of sitting on that line between the Caribbean and the southern portions of the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Cancun. It is nearly stationary. As of the 8 o'clock update, the only thing that changed is basically its movement. It went from stationary to 1 mile per hour. The center is not going to get a lot of momentum with it in the next 24 to 36 hours, and the forecast models are in agreement with that. This is just in from the National Hurricane Center earlier this afternoon. It is showing the center of this kind of meandering amongst itself through tonight and through much of Sunday. That's going to just kind of keep it in place with the potential of it to strengthen as it does so. And that's where we could likely be dealing with a tropical storm as we get throughout your Sunday forecast, especially by the second half of tomorrow. At that point, it would be a named storm. So we'd go from Tropical Depression 10 to then Tropical Storm Idalia. That is the next name on the list. As we get into Monday, here's where we start to actually pick up some changes. This system, not only does it strengthen throughout that tropical storm status, but it finally gets a little bit of momentum, a little forward movement into the southern and southeastern portions of the Gulf of Mexico. And that is where we have incredibly warm Gulf waters. We also have limited shear. Shear is what helps to rip apart those tropical systems. If you don't have a whole lot of wind shear going on higher in the atmosphere, that is actually going to be conducive for further development. And that is why the forecast trend is picking up on not only a strong tropical storm throughout Monday and Tuesday, but possibly by Tuesday night, we could be right on that line of a Category 1 hurricane. Hurricane Category 1 status is official once you get to 74 miles per hour or higher with those maximum sustained wind speeds. We're going to be right on that line, and that forecast is expected to hold as it gets closer and closer to the Big Bend area. I want to stress something when it comes to this track, though. A lot of people see this track and they think that's going to be the area where impacts will be felt. That is not the case. I need you to understand that the track is going to be basically giving us an idea of where the center of anything tropical will fall. In this case, it's this system. It could fall as far west as Pensacola or as far east as Pinellas County. What's happening in between is basically where a lot of our computer models, our ensemble models, are agreeing that it's going to try to aim for is within that swath of window as far as the center of the storm. The greatest amount of impacts typically happen to the right side of that storm. So that is what we're going to be watching out for over the next several days, is to see if this model at all tries to wiggle a little bit more to the left or if it stays pretty consistent towards the Big Bend. And I say stays pretty consistent because a lot of those models that I just mentioned, that computer models were basically running it through the system over and over again with this storm, is continuing to show that broad area where we'll be watching, basically keeping it along the Florida Gulf Coast between the Panhandle, possibly I-4 corridor, and just to the north, right in that realm. So that's what we'll be watching out for. I do think the impacts, though, they could be felt far and wide. So let me walk you through some of our future models, because this is the one we've been showing you nearly all week long. This is also the model that has been picking up on this potential tropical development that is now officially a tropical depression. This is our European. I'm taking you through tomorrow night, so we're almost 24 hours into the future. See how this guy's still sitting in the same area. So there's not going to be a whole lot of movement between tonight and tomorrow night. By Monday night, we finally get this to nudge its way into the southeastern portions of the Gulf of Mexico. But notice Monday night going into Tuesday, the outer bands, the outer impacts, that rain, some of those increased winds, those will start to be felt across parts of Florida and even eventually inching its way into west central Florida. And then you'll notice the closer and closer the center of that system gets to our neck of the woods, the more we will feel those impacts as far as tropical storm force winds, those bands of heavy rainfall, and even some spots of storm surge, which we'll talk about here in just a few moments. So that is the European pulling further and further off to the east coast by the middle of next week. This is the GFS. This is an American model that took a little bit of longer time to actually grab onto this development, but it is doing so now. And look, as we go through not only tomorrow, but even into Monday afternoon, still kind of hanging out in the Yucatan Channel, eventually drifting off into the southeastern portions of the Gulf of Mexico, but then pulling up a little bit quicker, as well as trying to strengthen the system from a tropical storm back up to possibly a Category 1 hurricane as well. So there's going to be there's some dynamics there that are conducive for further development to get it to that hurricane status, but just how long we have that is going to be a question mark, as well as how quickly can this scoot through the eastern Gulf. The faster it can push through, that'll actually lessen our impacts here at home, and that will also try to limit just how much water we're getting into the bay from storm surge, how much of that heavy rain bands will be hanging around, and factors like that. This GFS model has also been kind of favoring a little bit more so of the panhandle for development rather than the Big Bend, Cedar Key area like the European has been looking at. So when it comes to the rain and those impacts, let's try to get you a little bit of a better overview of this, because we are starting to kind of get a better lens of those impacts and what could possibly be felt here. Because again, it just recently formed in the last few hours. Now we're getting into a deeper dive into our computer models and what they're picking up on. If we do have either a strong tropical storm or a Category 1 hurricane, the center of it just off the coast of West Florida and just over the eastern portions of the Gulf, the heaviest of the rain is going to fall along the Gulf and along portions of the immediate Gulf Coast. In some spots, we could see anywhere from about 3 to 6 inches, especially along that I-75 corridor. The further inland you are, you're going to see less of those heavier downpours. You'll get some of them, but you won't get nearly as many high totals in those rain buckets. But you'll notice along the immediate coast, that is where we could have 5 to 6 inches of rainfall from this entire event. And in some locations, it could be even isolated higher than that, where we'll have some of those heavier downpours. There is a switch to this, and that actually is going to be the fact that we could use some of that rain. In a normal situation, especially in the rainy season, that can be a lot of rain in a short amount of time, and sometimes our rivers, our creeks, sometimes even our soil can't handle that much moisture, especially if we've been dealing with excessive moisture recently. Well, that's not the case. We haven't been. We do have an extreme to severe drought across parts of not only the Bay Area, but the immediate coast. So the soil can actually handle half a foot of rain at this point. That's not to say there's not going to be flooding, but there will be some isolated spots we'll have to watch out for. But we could use the rain. This is not so much what we want. Those tropical storm force winds, which are basically exceeding wind speeds of 40 miles per hour or higher. You'll see the eastern half of the storm, of any type of strengthening storm, will have the strongest portions of those winds. And as that storm pushes up towards either the Big Bend or the Panhandle, you'll see that wind kind of pushing in from the southwest, trying to drive some water into the bay. But remember, I mentioned how quickly the storm can move into the Panhandle will limit just how much water can get into the bay, because it will be a fast mover. I don't think the storm's going to linger very long in the eastern Gulf of Mexico like it is doing right now in the Yucatan. It's going to have some push with it. It's going to have some forward momentum. So the time frame of those impacts could be a little shorter than, say, what we would have if we had just a storm sitting off the coast there in the Gulf of Mexico. Needless to say, those rain bands associated with it and the wind associated with it will have some impacts. I do think we're going to still fine-tune this forecast when it comes to the rain, when it comes to those tropical storm force winds, maybe even isolate spots along the coast dealing with hurricane force winds in some locations, as well as the storm surge. So
As mentioned, right now we're looking at 3 to 6 inches in some locations just from this event alone. The coastal spots will see the higher amounts. Coastal storm surge is also something we'll be monitoring. Right now, we are going to be dealing with high tide across parts of the region. I do think because of the fact we'll have high tide for hours at a time, we're going to see tides running about half a foot to about a foot higher than normal. So on top of that aside, then you're going to add storm surge about 3 to 5 feet in some of those locations. That is going to be expected more so along the barrier islands along the immediate west coast. That's a little bit less of an impact to the further intercoastal you go, but I do think along the barrier islands, that's going to be more likely the forecast at this point in time. Depending where the center of this system goes in the Eastern Gulf, that will affect that. That could change. But just a heads up, that's kind of what we're starting to get a clearer lens on as far as those two impacts. Then we're talking winds, those tropical storm force winds. If we have a strengthening system, a strengthening tropical storm right off the coast, we will see more of those impacts and more of those gusty conditions prolonged across the immediate parts of the coastline. But the National Hurricane Center is saying that there is wiggle room for this to potentially turn into a low-end Category 1 hurricane by the time we get to the early parts of next week. All those factors I mentioned, the rain, the wind, the surge, all of those impacts could start as early as Monday night, especially some of the rain and the wind, but we will notice as we get through Tuesday and Wednesday, those are really going to be the days of interest, the days where we will have some of the greatest impacts, whether this system is a little further off towards the west or if it's a little bit along the coast trying to hug us a bit closer. Those details we're still trying to fine tune, but I do think Tuesday, Wednesday is going to be the day you're wanting to stay weather aware. This is a forecast we'll continue to fine tune for you. As mentioned, it's Tropical Depression 10 right now. Once it reaches tropical storm status, Idalia, that is the next name on the list, and that is the one we'll be talking about as we go through the middle of next week. We have live updates that we're going to continue to bring for you all weekend long. We're also going to be live on 10 Tampa Bay coming up at 11 o'clock tonight, and you'll continue to see live updates here on our social media platforms as well as 10 Tampa Bay Plus app. That's going to be all throughout the rest of the weekend and into early next week. We're your 10 Tampa Bay Hurricane Headquarters, and we'll be keeping you updated throughout the storm.